This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In today's video, we're looking at a much maligned mechanic in Cumulative Upkeep. The genesis of this particular list does a good job of indicating how negatively this mechanic is viewed. I was actually researching a video on the game's worst mechanics and assumed that Cumulative Upkeep was going to be in the list. I knew that a few cards with Cumulative Upkeep had seen play, but it ended up being a lot more than I expected. That list on worst mechanics, which will now come out next week, uses objective data like tournament results to discuss bad mechanics, but I was somewhat surprised to find that Cumulative Upkeep, while certainly nowhere near a top performer when it comes to mechanics, does have 10 cards that have at least one Premier Event top 8. There are 88 cards in the game with Cumulative Upkeep, so 10 having one or more point using my system certainly isn't impressive, but as we'll see next week, it's way better than the 10 mechanics that will make the worst mechanic video. Something I don't normally do at the beginning of these videos is explain exactly how a mechanic works, but because this one is fairly obscure, it hasn't appeared on a card since 2006, and it doesn't always come with reminder text, let's take a minute to discuss this mechanic. This also gives us a good chance to look at how bad this mechanic can be at its absolute worst. So, Juju Bubble is widely heralded as one of the worst cards in the game, and it's a good example of how Cumulative Upkeep can be horrible. As the name Cumulative Upkeep implies, every upkeep you have to pay a cost for something with Cumulative Upkeep, and as the word cumulative indicates, this cost increases every turn. So with Juju Bubble, you have to pay 1 generic mana on the first upkeep after you played it, or it goes to the graveyard. You then add a time counter to it to keep track of how many times you've paid it, and then on subsequent turns you have to pay 1 mana and then a mana for each of the time counters. So in other words, you pay more mana every turn. It's cumulative. So generally, cards with Cumulative Upkeep become pretty difficult to keep in play, at least if you want to continue to develop your board. As we'll see though, there are some cards with Cumulative Upkeep that aren't like Juju Bubble, and they were designed in such a way that they're actually good. Usually this is because the card is so efficient you don't mind paying the cost. Alright, let's get to the actual list part of the video, but before we do, a quick reminder on how I score cards on these lists. Pro Tour and Mythic Championship top 8s, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. Now, let's move to number 10. At number 10, we have Wall of Shards. When Cumulative Upkeep returned in Cold Snap after not having appeared on a card since 1997, they did some more interesting things with it, like making cost be things other than mana. In this case, you get a super efficient defensive creature, but your opponent gets to gain an ever-increasing amount of life every turn. Generally, if you're in the market for a defensive creature like this, your opponent gaining life isn't that big of a deal. The one Grand Prix top 8 this got was in 2008 in the sideboard of a Revelark deck. It was used as sideboard tech against fairies, who would have some serious problems getting through a defensive flying creature this big. Most of their removal was bounce, or stealing a creature with Sword of Temptation, neither of which were especially effective against Wall of Shards. The deck also ran ways of resetting the time counters on it, so it could slow down the life gain if it needed to. This one appearance in a sideboard is all Wall of Shards has, and I don't imagine it ever really shining anywhere in the future, though it does combo nicely with Tainted Remedy. At number 9, I have Elephant Grass, a card with Cumulative Upkeep that I actually knew had seen some play. I got really into Legacy 5 or 6 years ago, and the deck I went with was Enchantress. The deck runs a bunch of creatures like Argothi and Enchantress, who draw you cards when you play enchantments. The deck plans on locking down the board with prison-type enchantments, while slowly building an advantage and eventually winning the game. Elephant Grass was one of those prison enchantments. It makes it very hard for your opponent to attack you, while you continue to build massive card advantage by playing other cheap enchantments and digging for a win condition. This worked well in Enchantress decks, which ran tons of cheap spells and ripped through a deck quickly, meaning it could just stop paying for the grass when the time came. It also managed one Block Pro Tour top 8 back in 1997 as a sideboard card against the popular black aggro decks of the time. While I have a soft spot for Enchantress decks, they haven't really been relevant in Legacy for a long time, and I don't see Elephant Grass doing a whole lot more going forward. At number 8 is Mystic Remora, an example of a card with Cumulative Upkeep that is so efficient, it sort of gets over that problem. Making your opponent pay a ton of extra mana every time they play a non-creature spell, or you get to draw a card when they play that spell, also helps offset the fact that you have to pay progressively more mana for it, because your opponent has to pay a bunch of extra mana or give you card advantage. However, Remora wasn't exactly a card that anyone was talking about when it was originally printed. Instead, it started seeing play in 2015, 20 years after it was originally printed, and in Magic's most powerful format, Vintage. Most decks play predominantly non-creature spells in the format, so if you play this, your opponent has to make some difficult decisions, or even better, they can't make those decisions and you just get to draw extra cards. Decks that have run it include Landstill and Monastery Mentor decks. And number 7 is Energy Storm, a card that can shut down burn spells and creatures with flying. Even though it comes with that annoying cumulative upkeep, the benefits this card could bring you out of your sideboard were enough that you could cope with paying such a steep cost. It was particularly useful back in 1996 against a mono-black aggro deck of the time, which ran flyers like Hypnotic Spectre and Sengir Vampire, and burn spells like Drain Life. This card dealt with all of those cards really effectively. It was a sideboard card primarily in non-black aggro decks in the format who weren't nearly as affected by the text as those black decks were. It did everything it would ever do back in 1996, but hey, it isn't like Cumulative Upkeep is coming back anytime soon, unless they decide to put it on some new cards in Modern Horizons, but I kind of doubt that. Either way, its position on this list is probably fairly secure. At number 6, we have a card that is actually pretty bad in Illusions of Grandeur. I mean, sure, it gains you 20 life, but you have to give that life right back pretty quickly because it isn't like Cumulative Upkeep 2 is something you're going to be able to keep on paying. However, it being so bad was actually a good thing for one particularly wacky deck in the extended format of 2000 and 2001. This was a deck called Tricks. At the time, lots of Tier 1 decks were named after cereals. Probably a topic for a whole other video. But anyway, the deck planned on playing Delusions of Grandeur and gaining the 20 life, and then using Donate to give it to your opponent. That way, your opponent never gained the 20 life, you got to hold on to your 20 life, and eventually, when they couldn't pay for it anymore, they would take 20 damage to the face, which generally, as you probably know, is enough to end the game on the spot. So yeah, this was bad, but its badness could be harnessed by decks running Donate. At number 5, we have JOTUN GRUNT, the only card on this list to have made another appearance on an MTG Top 10, with its appearance coming just a few weeks back on my Giants list. So, like Elephant Grass, this was a card with cumulative upkeep I knew had at least a few points. This, like Wall of Shards, is a cumulative upkeep card from Cold Snap, and, like the Wall, it has a design more interesting than just being something you have to pay ever-increasing mana for. Instead, there have to be more and more cards in either your or your opponent's graveyard, and he's happy. This could even be an upside depending on situations. If your opponent likes loading up their graveyard, you get a super efficient creature that can disrupt that. If there are cards in your graveyard that maybe you want to draw again, well, it can help with that too. While he never saw play in Standard, there was just no metagame where he made sense there, he did see play in Extended and Legacy. In Extended, he was particularly effective against dredge decks who like to load up their graveyards and use them as a resource. The Grunt could make that difficult, and always having enough cards to gobble up every turn was pretty much guaranteed against dredge. That metagame also featured the graveyard-heavy Psychotog deck. The Grunt was a great asset for aggro decks who didn't have to give up having an efficient creature to play graveyard hate. They could just do both. These decks were such a big part of the metagame that most decks ran a couple Grunts in the main board and a couple more in the sideboard. In Legacy, it filled a similar role, where it could disrupt Threshold decks as well as Reanimation decks. JOTUN GRUNT hasn't seen play since 2012, and these days people seem more interested in more powerful graveyard hate, as opposed to a card that fits nicely on the curve while also going after graveyards, so it may not move up this list anytime soon. At number 4, we have Mind Harness, a card that, I have to admit, I had no recollection of ever existing before I made this list. Mind Harness is another card that does something powerful so efficiently that having to pay cumulative upkeep isn't a huge deal. 1 blue mana to steal a creature is incredibly powerful, and yes, you can only steal red or green creatures, but against decks that are running those, this card is off the charts powerful, even with cumulative upkeep. Stealing a creature is always incredibly powerful because it's not only a removal spell, you get to develop your own board by getting control of the creature that you essentially remove from your opponent. Obviously, it is a complete dud against some people, so it is sideboard material, but some serious power to bring out of the sideboard. It put up 3 Pro Tour top 8s at the Block Pro Tour in 1997, where it was particularly effective against red aggro decks of the time. Then it went quiet for 5 years before emerging in the top 8 of an extended Grand Prix in 2002, another format with a prominent red aggro deck, and then it went even longer, 10 years before another Grand Prix top 8 in 2012, this time in Legacy, which, you guessed it, had another prominent red aggro deck. While it hasn't seen play in 7 years now, if Legacy is ever bogged down by red or green creature-based decks, you can bet this will see some play again. At number 8, we have Infernal Darkness. This one comes with a steep cumulative upkeep cost. Not only do you have to pay ever-increasing mana, but also ever-increasing life. It was a key sideboard card for one of Magic's most busted decks ever, Necropotence. This powerful enchantment could let you draw boatloads of cards in exchange for life, so the deck also ran ways to gain life, like Drain Life, which made it so that you could draw even more. It also meant that you could pay the cumulative upkeep on Infernal Darkness more. Infernal Darkness gives you a powerful land hoser that is incredibly strong against anyone not playing mono black, since it locks everyone else out of their colors. The Necropotence deck could use it to stall to find a Necropotence, at which point the game would quickly be over. It put up 4 top 8s, all in 1996 and 1997, and all in Necropotence decks. Its days in the sun are long over, but Infernal Darkness frustrated a lot of people back in the mid-90s. At number 2, there's a land with cumulative upkeep in Glacial Chasm. The Chasm asks a lot of you. First, you have to sacrifice a land just to play it. Second, it doesn't produce mana, so you're going down on mana when you do that. And third, it has a cumulative upkeep cost that becomes progressively more painful. Finally, it doesn't let your creatures attack. But it does give you something nice in return. A fog effect for as long as you can pay life for it. And you'll be able to for a while because, hey, your opponent can't damage you. Like some of the other cards on this list, it took a while for Glacial Chasm to find success. It was printed in 1995, and it didn't put up its first Premier Event top 8 until 2010, when it burst onto the scene as part of a new deck in the Legacy metagame called Lands, a deck that runs a ton of lands, 35 or more, and can tutor up whichever ones it needs at will, and eventually wins the game by comboing Dark Depths and Thespian Stage. The deck runs a singleton Chasm to be tutored up in situations where it is at its best. The Lands deck has gone on to be highly successful in Legacy, and Glacial Chasm may actually have a shot at taking the number 1 spot on this list in the near future. Glacial Chasm was the card that I was guessing would be number 1 on this list when I looked into it, but I was wrong, because at number 1, it's Dystopia. This is yet another cumulative upkeep card that only hoses certain colors, making it super powerful in some matchups and useless in others, and that's why this has always been a sideboard card. Dystopia doesn't make you pay mana at all, instead lets you pay life, which for several turns is definitely worth it for it to eat a permanent of your opponent's every turn. Unlike most cards with cumulative upkeep, you can still keep building your board because you're not paying mana, and that's especially devastating as this takes something off of your opponent's board each turn. Like Infernal Darkness, Dystopia was also featured in the sideboards of Necropotence decks, but unlike Infernal Darkness, Dystopia made it into the sideboards of the extended version of the deck too. Eventually, Necropotence got banned and extended, and the much-loved sideboard card never found a home again. Well, that does it for today's MTG Top 10. As I teased earlier in this video, next week's MTG Top 10s are going to look at the best and worst mechanics in the history of the game. If you want to make sure you catch that and my other upcoming MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you want to see all the MTG Top 10s I've done so far, you should see the playlist on your screen now. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. Thanks for watching.